Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Ken Wilber, the architect of integral consciousness. Together and apart, they charted the vast territories where psychology meets spirituality, where individual awakening touches collective evolution. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the depths of human transformation. One seeing the eternal return of archetypal patterns, the other discovering the ascending spiral of consciousness through ever higher structures of understanding. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Ken Wilber as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the summer of 1949, Carl Jung stood at a threshold he had spent decades approaching. He was 74 years old, white-haired and weathered by the storms of psychological discovery, standing in the garden of his tower at Bollingen, the stone sanctuary he had built with his own hands on the shores of Lake Zurich. The water lapped gently against the shore, and in the evening light, everything seemed suspended between the visible and invisible worlds. Jung had spent his life exploring the psyche's depth, diving into dreams, myths, and the strange synchronicities that seemed to whisper of an underlying unity beneath the fragmented surface of modern consciousness. He had mapped territories that few others dared to enter: the shadow's dark forests, the anima and animus dancing their eternal dance, the archetypes rising from the collective unconscious, like ancient gods returning to claim their place in the human story. Jung's journey had taken him far from the rationalist corridors of medicine and psychiatry. Born in 1875 in the Swiss countryside, he had grown up between worlds: his father, a rural pastor wrestling with doubts; his mother, a woman who seemed to shift between two personalities, one conventional and one deeply intuitive and strange. Young Carl felt the presence of something numinous in the world, a secret life beneath the surface of things. He experienced visions, premonitions, dreams that felt more real than waking life. When he entered psychiatry, he brought with him this sensitivity to the hidden dimensions, this willingness to take seriously what others dismissed as mere fantasy or pathology. His years with Sigmund Freud, beginning in 1907, had been formative and ultimately shattering. Freud became the father Jung had never truly had, the brilliant mind who validated his sense that human consciousness contained vast, unexplored territories. But their break, coming around 1913, sent Jung spiraling into what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. For years, he descended into his own depths, recording dreams and visions in what would become known as the Red Book, a manuscript of extraordinary beauty and strangeness that he would never publish in his lifetime. In those visions, he encountered figures: Philemon, Salome, ancient wise men, and terrible shadows that seemed to possess their own reality, their own wisdom, independent of his conscious mind. From this descent, Jung emerged with a new psychology, one that honored the reality of the psyche's autonomous contents, that saw dreams and myths not as disguises for infantile wishes, but as genuine messages from a deeper intelligence. He developed the concept of the collective unconscious, a shared substrate of human experience containing the archetypes, primordial patterns of human possibility, the heroes and monsters, the wise old men and great mothers, the tricksters and saviors that appear in every culture's mythology. These archetypes, Jung argued, were not learned but inherited, structural predispositions of the psyche itself, awaiting the proper conditions to manifest in individual experience. By mid-century, Jung had built an elaborate theoretical edifice. He had explored alchemy as a symbolic language of psychological transformation, traveled to Africa and India to encounter other cultural approaches to consciousness, and developed a therapeutic approach aimed at what he called individuation, the process by which a person becomes truly themselves, integrating the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche into a unified whole symbolized by the self. His work was controversial, often dismissed by mainstream psychiatry as mystical or unscientific, but it attracted followers who recognized in his writings something that spoke to their own deepest experiences. Yet for all Jung's extraordinary mapping of the psyche's depths, his work remained deliberately unsystematized. He resisted creating a neat theoretical system, preferring instead to circle around his central insights from multiple angles, using alchemical metaphors one moment and clinical case studies the next, drawing on Gnostic texts and modern physics in equal measure. This style suited his understanding of the unconscious as fundamentally paradoxical and irreducible to simple formulas. But it also made his work difficult to integrate with other psychological approaches. His maps of the psyche were rich and evocative, but frustratingly imprecise. How exactly did the archetypes relate to personal experience? What was the relationship between the collective unconscious and cultural development? Where did Jung's psychology fit in relation to developmental theories, to spiritual traditions, to evolutionary understanding? These questions would remain open long after Jung's death in 1961. His influence spread through analytical psychology institutes, through the work of followers like Marie-Louise von Franz and James Hillman, through the incorporation of Jungian ideas into popular culture. But the question of how to systematize and integrate Jung's insights with broader frameworks of human development and consciousness remained largely unaddressed. That is, until a young American philosopher began constructing what would become the most ambitious attempt to create a comprehensive map of consciousness that humanity had yet produced. Ken Wilber was born on January 31st, 1949, the same year Jung stood in his garden contemplating the mysteries he had spent a lifetime exploring. Wilber's childhood in Oklahoma bore little resemblance to Jung's in Switzerland. He grew up in Middle America in the 1950s and 60s, a period of post-war optimism shadowed by nuclear anxiety and cultural upheaval. He was a serious, intellectually gifted child who devoured books and wrestled with the big questions of existence from an early age. Where Jung had been shaped by the numinous landscape of Swiss Christianity and the hidden occult undercurrents of European culture, Wilber came of age in a society undergoing rapid transformation, where the counterculture was beginning to question every established institution and to look toward Eastern spirituality for alternatives to Western materialism. Wilber initially studied medicine at Duke University, but found himself drawn more powerfully toward questions that medicine could not answer. What is consciousness? What is the relationship between matter and mind? Is there a pattern to human development that encompasses both individual growth and the evolution of cultures? These questions led him away from pre-med and toward an intensive period of independent study. He dropped out of graduate school and spent years in what he would later describe as a fever of reading and synthesis, consuming everything he could find in psychology, philosophy, anthropology, and especially the wisdom traditions of both East and West. By his early 20s, living simply and writing intensively, Wilber had conceived an audacious project. What if all the various schools of psychology, psychoanalysis, behaviorism, humanistic psychology, transpersonal psychology were not contradictory, but were actually describing different levels or dimensions of a single spectrum of consciousness? What if Freud was right about one level, Jung about another, and the Eastern contemplatives about yet another? What if human consciousness developed through distinct stages, from the pre-personal realms of instinct and impulse, through the personal realms of ego and reason, and into transpersonal realms of spiritual realization? And what if each psychological school had focused on one particular band of this spectrum? This insight became the foundation for Wilber's first major work, The Spectrum of Consciousness, completed when he was just 23 years old and published in 1977. The book was remarkable for its scope and ambition. Wilber proposed that consciousness exists not as a single thing, but as a spectrum, like white light passing through a prism to reveal many colors. At one end of the spectrum were the most contracted, defended, limited forms of awareness, the neurotic structures Freud had explored. Moving along the spectrum, consciousness gradually expanded and integrated more of its possibilities, the existential and humanistic levels, where a person becomes more authentic and whole, the subtle levels where mystical and psychic experiences emerge, and finally, the ultimate level where individual consciousness recognizes its identity with absolute reality itself, the non-dual awareness described in Vedanta and Buddhism. Jung appeared throughout Wilber's early work, but in a specific location. For Wilber, Jung had mapped certain crucial territories, particularly the archetypal and collective dimensions of the psyche, but had not sufficiently distinguished between different levels and stages of consciousness development. Jung's work was valuable, even essential, but it needed to be situated within a larger developmental framework. This positioning would become characteristic of Wilber's relationship to Jung. Profound respect combined with systematic critique and recontextualization. As Wilber developed his integral theory through the 1980s and 90s, he drew on an ever wider range of sources. He incorporated developmental psychology, particularly the stage theories of Jean Piaget, Lawrence Kohlberg, and Jane Loevinger, which described how human cognition and moral reasoning develop through distinct, hierarchical stages from childhood through adulthood. He integrated evolutionary theory, seeing consciousness itself as part of the universe's evolutionary unfolding. He drew deeply on spiritual traditions, particularly Buddhism and Vedanta, which he saw as providing the most sophisticated maps of the highest levels of consciousness development. And he engaged extensively with Western philosophy, from Plato and Plotinus through Hegel and Heidegger to contemporary thinkers. What emerged was what Wilber called integral theory, a framework attempting to honor and include all valid approaches to understanding consciousness, development, and reality. Central to this framework was the concept of holons entities that are simultaneously wholes in themselves and parts of larger wholes, nested like Russian dolls in what Wilber called holarchies. A cell is a whole that contains molecules, but it is also part of a larger whole, an organ. An individual human is a whole with its own integrity, but also a part of larger social and ecological wholes. Consciousness itself develops in holarchical fashion, with each new level transcending and including the previous levels. By the time Wilber published Sex, Ecology, Spirituality in 1995, his system had become extraordinarily complex and comprehensive. He had developed what he called the 4 quadrants, different perspectives from which any phenomenon can be viewed. The interior individual perspective of consciousness and psychology, the exterior individual perspective of biology and behavior, the interior collective perspective of culture and shared meaning, and the exterior collective perspective of social systems and structures. Every phenomenon, Wilber argued, has all 4 of these dimensions, and a truly integral approach must honor all of them. He had also elaborated what he called the levels or stages of consciousness development, drawing on multiple developmental theories to create what he saw as a universal pattern of growth from archaic and magical consciousness through mythic and rational consciousness to pluralistic and integral and ultimately transpersonal levels. Each level brought new capacities and new perspectives, and evolution itself could be understood as the progressive emergence of higher levels of complexity and consciousness. In all of this elaborate theorizing, Jung remained a constant reference point for Wilber, but one that had to be critiqued and recontextualized. Wilber saw Jung as having made crucial discoveries, particularly regarding the reality of transpersonal and spiritual dimensions of the psyche, at a time when mainstream psychology was aggressively materialistic and reductionistic. Jung had recognized that the psyche contains depths that cannot be reduced to childhood trauma or conditioned behaviors, that there are genuine transcendent experiences and collective patterns of meaning. Jung had also recognized the importance of integrating opposites, of bringing together conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter, into a greater wholeness. But from Wilber's perspective, Jung had made several critical errors. First, he had failed to distinguish clearly between different levels of consciousness. Jung treated all unconscious contents as if they existed on the same plane, whether they were personal repressions, collective archetypes, or genuine spiritual insights. Wilber argued that this conflated pre-personal and transpersonal, the primitive and the transcendent, in ways that led to confusion. Second, Jung had been insufficiently developmental. He had described psychological types and processes, but had not articulated a clear sequence of stages through which consciousness evolves. Third, Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, while pointing towards something real, was too vague and amorphous. Wilber wanted to replace it with a more structured understanding of how collective patterns manifest at different levels of development. Most fundamentally, Wilber felt that Jung's crowning concept of individuation, the process of becoming a whole and unique self, was not the endpoint of psychological development, but rather a mid-level achievement. True development, in Wilber's view, required going beyond individuation into what he called the transpersonal stages, where the sense of being a separate self gradually dissolves and consciousness recognizes its unity with all of reality. Jung, Wilber believed, had mapped some of the pathways toward these higher stages, but had not clearly articulated them as distinct levels transcending the individuated ego. So, as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, two great bodies of work stood in complex relationship to each other. Jung's psychology, developed from the 1920s through the 50s, offered a rich phenomenology of the psyche's depths, a treasure trove of insights into symbols, dreams, myths, and the process of psychological and spiritual transformation. It was rooted in clinical experience and in Jung's own profound inner explorations, and it spoke to the lived reality of psychological experience in a way that resonated deeply with many who encountered it. But it remained deliberately unsystematic, resistant to neat categorization, paradoxical and circular in its reasoning. Wilber's integral theory, developed from the 1970s through the first decades of the 21st century, offered an extraordinarily comprehensive and systematic framework for understanding consciousness, development, and evolution. It attempted to create a meta-theory that could include and integrate all valid approaches to knowledge, from empirical science to contemplative practice. It was precise, hierarchical, and confident in its ability to map the territories of consciousness with clarity and detail. But it was also abstract and intellectual, sometimes seeming to lose touch with the lived complexity of individual human experience in favor of theoretical elegance. The dialogue between these two visions of consciousness, Jung's depth-oriented, paradox-embracing, mythically grounded approach, and Wilber's integral, developmentally structured, systematically comprehensive approach reveals fundamental tensions in how we understand the human psyche. It is a conversation about the relationship between depth and height, between the timeless and the evolutionary, between the circular path of return and the ascending spiral of transcendence. And it is a conversation that continues to shape how we think about consciousness, spirituality, and the potential for human transformation. Let us pause here and feel the weight of what these two men attempted. Jung, descending into his own depths and returning with maps of territories he found there, insisting that the psyche must be met on its own terms, in its own symbolic language. Wilber, standing back and attempting to see the largest possible pattern, the overarching structure that contains all the particular phenomena, believing that only such a comprehensive vision can guide humanity's continued evolution. Two men, two visions, each responding to the call of something vast within and beyond individual consciousness. As you settle more deeply into rest, let us explore how their visions both converge and diverge, how they might speak to each other across the years that separate them. The foundational difference between Jung and Wilber reveals itself most clearly in how they approach the question of psychological depth. For Jung, the unconscious was not simply that which is not conscious. It was a realm with its own reality, its own intelligence, its own purposiveness. He experienced this directly in his confrontation with the unconscious, when figures like Philemon appeared to him with a vividness and autonomy that convinced him they were not merely projections of his own mind, but manifestations of something deeper and more objective. This led Jung to develop his concept of the objective psyche, the idea that consciousness emerges from unconscious depths that have their own creative power and wisdom, depths that connect individual experience to collective patterns that are in some sense eternal. When Jung spoke of archetypes, he was describing forms or patterns that structure psychological experience but can never be directly perceived themselves. The archetype as such, he insisted, remains forever unknowable, residing in the unconscious depths. What we encounter are archetypal images, the specific ways these patterns manifest in dreams, myths, art, and religious experience. The hero, the mother, the wise old man, the divine child, These figures appear across cultures and across time because they reflect fundamental patterns of human experience, built into the very structure of the psyche through our evolutionary history. Jung saw his task as a psychologist to help people recognize and relate to these archetypal patterns, to see how they were being lived in individual life. A woman in midlife crisis might be experiencing the activation of the animus, the inner masculine, calling her to develop qualities of assertiveness and independence she had previously projected onto men. A man wrestling with depression might be encountering the shadow, those rejected and repressed aspects of himself that demanded integration. A person drawn to spiritual seeking might be responding to the archetype of the self, the organizing center of the psyche that transcends and includes the ego, symbolized in images of mandalas, divine children, or united opposites. This approach meant that for Jung, psychological work was fundamentally about making the unconscious conscious, about bringing into awareness and relationship what had been operating autonomously in the depths. But this was not a matter of simply analyzing and dissolving unconscious contents, as it tended to be for Freud. Rather, it was about learning to dialogue with the unconscious, to honor its reality, to allow its symbols and images to work on consciousness and transform it. Jung's method of active imagination involved precisely this, entering into a kind of waking dream state and allowing unconscious figures to emerge and speak, engaging them in conversation, allowing the encounter to unfold according to its own logic. The goal of this work was individuation, which Jung saw as the central task of the second half of life. Individuation meant becoming the particular individual one is meant to be different from the collective persona and social roles one has adopted, but also different from the ego's limited conception of itself. It meant integrating the opposites, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, good and evil, personal and collective, into a larger wholeness symbolized by the self. This self was paradoxically both the center and the circumference of the psyche, both the goal of development and the organizing principle present from the beginning. Jung understood individuation not as a linear process with a clear endpoint, but as a circumambulation of the self, a spiral path that returned again and again to central mysteries from ever deeper perspectives. Crucially, Jung did not see individuation as transcending the archetypal realm, but as realizing one's unique relationship to it. The individuated person does not become free of archetypes, but becomes conscious of how they are manifesting in their particular life, able to work with them creatively rather than being unconsciously possessed by them. There was, in Jung's view, no getting beyond the archetypes, no final transcendence of the collective unconscious, because these form the eternal ground from which individual consciousness emerges and to which it remains forever connected. Ken Wilber approached consciousness from an entirely different angle. His foundational insight was developmental and evolutionary. Consciousness, in Wilber's view, is not static, but grows, evolves, develops through distinct stages that form a hierarchy of increasing complexity, inclusiveness, and capacity. This was not just true for individuals, but for the collective evolution of consciousness through history. Just as a child's consciousness develops from the sensorimotor intelligence of infancy through the concrete operations of childhood to the abstract reasoning of adolescence and potentially beyond, human consciousness as a whole has evolved from the archaic and magical consciousness of early humanity, through the mythic consciousness of traditional cultures to the rational consciousness of modernity, and potentially toward even higher, integral, and transpersonal levels. Wilber's framework was fundamentally about height rather than depth, though he would argue it includes depth as one dimension within a larger space. Where Jung descended into the unconscious to find the archetypes, Wilber looked at how consciousness ascends through ever higher levels of organization and awareness. Each level, in Wilber's model, represents a new capacity, a new worldview, a new way of making meaning. And crucially, each level transcends and includes the previous levels. The child who develops rational thinking does not lose the capacity for emotion or sensation. Rather, these earlier capacities are incorporated into a larger, more complex structure. Similarly, when consciousness evolves to include transpersonal awareness, it does not abandon rationality, but incorporates it into a more comprehensive mode of being. This developmental framework led Wilber to articulate what he called the pre-trans fallacy, which would become one of his most important critiques of Jung and other psychologists. Wilber argued that there is a common confusion between prepersonal states of consciousness, the primitive, undifferentiated, immature forms of awareness that precede the development of a stable ego, and transpersonal states, the mature, integrated, transcendent forms of awareness that move beyond the ego while incorporating its achievements. Both prepersonal and transpersonal states involve a blurring of ego boundaries and a sense of merger with something larger, but they are radically different. The prepersonal is regressive, a return to infantile fusion. The transpersonal is progressive, an evolution to genuine mystical union. From Wilber's perspective, Jung was guilty of sometimes conflating these two domains. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, Wilber argued, lumped together pre-personal instinctual drives and transpersonal spiritual insights, making it difficult to distinguish regression from transcendence. Jung's interest in mythology and primitive symbolism sometimes led him to romanticize earlier, less developed forms of consciousness as if they had access to wisdom that modern rational consciousness had lost. But in Wilber's view, earlier forms of consciousness were not more spiritually advanced. They were simply less differentiated. True spiritual development required first differentiating and strengthening the ego through the personal stages, and only then transcending it in the transpersonal stages. Wilber's developmental model was detailed and specific, drawing on the work of researchers like Jean Gebser, Claire Graves, and others. He articulated multiple levels or stages of consciousness, which he sometimes called the spectrum of consciousness or the levels of the holarchy. In his earlier work, he emphasized levels like the sensorimotor, the emotional sexual, the mental egoic, the subtle, the causal, and the non-dual. In later refinements, he incorporated other developmental lines and streams, recognizing that different capacities, cognitive, moral, interpersonal, spiritual, could develop at different rates, and that development was messier and more multidimensional than simple stage models suggested. But the basic principle remained consistent. Consciousness develops through an evolutionary sequence, and higher stages are genuinely higher in the sense of being more inclusive, more complex, more capable of holding multiple perspectives simultaneously. A person at a rational stage of development can take the perspective of another person and reason abstractly about moral principles. A person at a pluralistic stage can recognize multiple valid perspectives and value diversity and inclusion. A person at an integral stage can see how all these different perspectives fit together into larger patterns and can hold paradox and complexity without collapsing into relativism or rigidity. For Wilber, the highest stages of development were the transpersonal ones, which he often described, using the categories from contemplative traditions, the subtle realm of divine light and archetypal visions, the causal realm of formless awareness and pure witness consciousness, and the non-dual realm, where subject and object, self and world, consciousness and matter are recognized as ultimately one. These were not mere experiences, but stable stages of consciousness that could be developed through sustained contemplative practice, and they represented the cutting edge of human evolutionary potential, where consciousness begins to awaken to its own deepest nature. In this framework, Jung's work could be appreciated, but also had to be resituated. Wilber saw Jung as having explored what he called the subtle level of consciousness, the realm of archetypal images, visions, and symbolic experience. This was indeed an important level, transcending the purely rational and opening to transpersonal dimensions. But Jung, in Wilber's view, had not clearly distinguished this level from others. He had not recognized it as one stage in a larger sequence, and most importantly, he had not gone far enough. The subtle level of archetypal images was not the ultimate. Beyond it lay the causal level of pure, formless awareness, and beyond that, the non-dual realization of absolute unity. These higher stages required a kind of meditative discipline and philosophical clarity that Jung, for all his genius, had not fully developed. Moreover, Wilber felt that Jung's concept of the self, while pointing towards something important, was ambiguous. Sometimes Jung used the self to mean the total psyche, conscious and unconscious together. Sometimes he used it to mean the organizing archetype of wholeness. Sometimes he seemed to identify it with what spiritual traditions call the ultimate reality or Godhead. This ambiguity, while perhaps reflecting the paradoxical nature of psychological experience, made it difficult to integrate Jung's ideas with other frameworks. Wilber preferred a more precise terminology, distinguishing between the person or organism as a whole, the central self or ego at each stage of development, and the ultimate self or pure consciousness that realizes its identity with all of reality at the highest transpersonal stages. Wilber's approach also differed fundamentally in its relationship to science and empiricism. While Jung had been trained as a psychiatrist and physician, his mature work moved increasingly toward a phenomenological and hermeneutic approach, taking seriously the reality of symbols and meanings that could not be quantified or objectively measured. Jung was willing to entertain ideas that science could not validate, drawing on alchemy, astrology, Gnosticism, and other pre-modern knowledge systems as sources of psychological insight. He famously proposed the concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggested a causal connecting principle in nature based partly on his collaboration with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli. Wilber, while deeply interested in spirituality and consciousness, wanted to ground his integral framework in what he called a post-metaphysical approach. This meant, among other things, being more cautious about ontological claims and more committed to methodological rigor. Wilber distinguished between different modes of knowing the eye of flesh, which perceives the physical world, the eye of mind, which perceives meaning and logic, and the eye of contemplation, which perceives spiritual realities, and argued that each has its own methods and validity claims. Scientific knowledge is not invalid, but neither is contemplative knowledge. They simply address different domains and require different epistemologies. From this perspective, some of Jung's theorizing could be seen as metaphysical speculation that went beyond what experience and evidence warranted. The collective unconscious as a kind of metaphysical substrate containing eternal archetypes, for example, might be better understood as the deep structures of consciousness at particular levels of development, shaped by evolution, but not existing in some timeless Platonic realm. Synchronicity, rather than requiring a new principle of a causal connection, might be understood in terms of the participatory relationship between consciousness and world at higher levels of development. These differences in foundational approach rippled through every aspect of how Jung and Wilber understood psychological work and human transformation. For Jung, the therapist's role was to facilitate the analysand's encounter with their own unconscious depths, to help them recognize and integrate the symbolic messages emerging from within. Interpretation was important, but so was simply witnessing and honoring the manifestations of the unconscious, trusting in the psyche's own self-regulating and self-healing capacities. Jung's own psychology had emerged from his personal descent and return. He trusted that each person's psyche contained its own wisdom and its own path toward wholeness. For Wilber, transformation required understanding where one is in the developmental sequence and what supports movement to the next level. Different stages require different interventions. Early stages may require strengthening ego boundaries and developing basic cognitive and emotional capacities. Middle stages may require challenging worldviews and expanding perspectives. Higher stages require contemplative practice and the cultivation of increasingly subtle forms of awareness. An integral approach to transformation would assess the person's level of development across multiple lines and tailor the approach accordingly. It would be more structured and directive than Jung's approach, more confident in its knowledge of where development is heading. These methodological differences reflected deeper philosophical differences about the nature of time and history. Jung's thinking was essentially cyclical. He saw the archetypes as eternal patterns that manifest again and again throughout history and individual life. The myths that guided ancient Greeks were structurally identical to the psychological patterns operating in modern humans. There was development in the sense of the ego emerging from unconscious participation with the collective and becoming more differentiated and conscious, but there was no ultimate directionality, no endpoint toward which everything was evolving. Life was a cycle of separation and return, of consciousness emerging from the unconscious and eventually returning to it, like the sun's daily journey from dawn through noon to dusk and night. Wilber's thinking was fundamentally evolutionary and directional. History is not just one thing after another, but a progressive unfolding of ever higher levels of consciousness and complexity. The universe itself evolves from matter to life to mind to spirit in what Wilber calls the great chain of being, though he reinterpreted this traditional concept in developmental and evolutionary terms. Humanity's journey is not a cycle, but an arrow or spiral, moving from less complex to more complex, from less conscious to more conscious, from partial to more whole. There are reversals and regressions, and nothing guarantees that evolution will continue to produce higher forms, but the general pattern is one of transcendence and inclusion, of reaching toward ever greater depth and span. This difference has profound implications for how each thinker understood suffering and pathology. For Jung, much of human suffering comes from one-sidedness, from the ego's attempt to identify with only one pole of a psychic opposite and repress or project the other. The rational person represses feeling. The moral person represses the shadow. The the masculine-identified person represses the feminine. Psychological health requires holding the tension of opposites, allowing consciousness to expand to include what has been excluded, working toward a wholeness that embraces paradox rather than resolving it. In this sense, Jung's psychology was fundamentally paradoxical and dialectical, always reaching toward synthesis but never claiming to achieve a final resolution. For Wilber, suffering often arises from being stuck at an inadequate level of development or from confusing levels. Someone stuck at an egocentric level of moral reasoning will inevitably create suffering for others because they cannot truly take another's perspective. Someone stuck at a mythic, literal level of religious understanding will miss the deeper symbolic and mystical dimensions of spirituality. Someone confusing pre-personal regression with transpersonal transcendence will get lost in primitive states thinking they have achieved enlightenment. Psychological health requires developing through the stages to higher, more adequate levels and practicing at each level until the next level becomes accessible. In this sense, Wilber's psychology is fundamentally oriented toward growth, toward the not yet realized potential that awaits development. As you rest here, breathing slowly, letting these ideas wash over you like waves, notice how each approach contains a kind of truth. Jung's insistence on the reality and wisdom of the unconscious depths, his respect for the symbolic language through which the psyche speaks, his recognition that wholeness requires embracing rather than transcending the irrational and the dark. These insights speak to something essential about psychological reality. But so does Wilber's recognition that consciousness genuinely develops, that some perspectives are more adequate than others, that growth requires differentiation before integration, that there are stages and structures to awareness that can be mapped and cultivated. Can both be true? Can depth and height, the eternal and the evolutionary, the circular and the spiral, be held together in a larger vision? This question brings us to the heart of how Jung and Wilber related to spirituality and to the great mystical traditions. Both men were deeply engaged with spiritual questions, but their approaches differed significantly. Jung's relationship to spirituality was complex and somewhat paradoxical. On one hand, he studied religions intensively, spent years exploring Christian mysticism, Gnosticism, alchemy, and Eastern philosophy, and clearly believed that spiritual experience was real and important. Many of his patients came to him with spiritual crises, and he developed therapeutic approaches specifically to help them integrate mystical experiences. On the other hand, Jung maintained a studied agnosticism about ultimate metaphysical questions. He insisted that as a psychologist and physician, he could only speak about psychological experience, not about whether God existed as a metaphysical reality independent of the psyche. His famous statement, "I don't believe, I know," referred to his direct experience of numinous psychic contents, not to a claim about objective theological truth. When he spoke of God, he carefully specified that he meant the God image in the psyche, the archetypal representation of wholeness and transcendence, without making claims about a divine being beyond the psyche. This stance frustrated both believers, who felt Jung was reducing religion to psychology, and atheists, who felt he was smuggling in mystical claims under cover of psychological language. But for Jung, it represented intellectual honesty. He had experienced the numinous, the overwhelming sense of encountering something sacred and transcendent, but he could not prove that these experiences corresponded to anything beyond the psyche. So he spoke of archetypes of the self, of individuation as a kind of redemption, of the psychological function of religious symbols, while leaving open the question of what might lie beyond psychological experience. This approach meant that Jung's psychology functioned for many of his followers as a kind of modern spirituality, a way of engaging with sacred dimensions of experience without requiring traditional religious belief. The symbols and practices of individuation, working with dreams, engaging in active imagination, exploring synchronicities, honoring the archetypal powers could meet spiritual needs while remaining grounded in psychological language. Jung's work attracted many people who had left traditional religion but still sensed something numinous in existence, something that scientific materialism could not adequately address. Wilber's relationship to spirituality was more overtly hierarchical and developmental. He made clear distinctions between different types and levels of spiritual experience and practice. At the most basic level, everyone has some form of spirituality, even if it is just a sense of wonder or meaning. But these experiences and beliefs are interpreted through the stage of consciousness at which the person is operating. Someone at a mythic stage will understand God as a parental figure who rewards and punishes. Someone at a rational stage might reject traditional religion entirely or reinterpret it symbolically. Someone at a pluralistic stage will embrace spiritual diversity and recognize many paths as valid. Someone at an integral stage will see how all these perspectives fit together as different levels and types of spiritual engagement. But beyond these stages of interpreting spiritual experience, Wilber also emphasized what he called states of consciousness, temporary shifts in awareness that could occur at any stage. These included waking, dreaming, and deep sleep states, but also higher states accessed through meditation, prayer, psychedelics, or spontaneously, subtle states of divine light and archetypal vision, causal states of formless awareness and emptiness, and non-dual states of unity with all reality. These states provided glimpses of higher levels of consciousness, and with practice, they could become stable traits, permanent characteristics of one's ongoing awareness. Wilber's own spiritual path included intensive meditation practice in several traditions, particularly Zen Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, and he eventually became authorized as a teacher in several lineages. This personal experience of contemplative practice deeply informed his theoretical work. He argued that the highest levels of consciousness described in his integral model were not merely theoretical constructs, but realities that could be directly experienced and stabilized through systematic meditation. The causal level of pure witness consciousness, for example, corresponded to advanced meditative states where one experiences oneself as pure awareness, unchanging and unborn, the witness of all experience but not identified with any content. The non-dual level corresponded to the highest realization in traditions like Dzogchen or Advaita Vedanta, where even the subject-object duality between witness and witnessed collapses into a recognition that consciousness and reality are ultimately one. This grounding in contemplative practice gave Wilber's work a different kind of authority than Jung's. Where Jung spoke from therapeutic experience and personal visionary encounters, Wilber spoke from the rigorous discipline of meditative attainment, backed by centuries of contemplative tradition. He could point to specific practices, breath, meditation, inquiry into the nature of mind, devotional contemplation that predictably produced particular states and stages of realization. This made his work more prescriptive and confident in its guidance. If you want to develop to higher levels, here are the practices that will take you there. But this also meant that Wilber was more critical of what he saw as spiritual bypassing or pseudo-spirituality. Jung's openness to all manifestations of the unconscious, including bizarre or primitive ones, struck Wilber as sometimes insufficiently discriminating. Not all unconscious contents are wise or healthy. Not all spiritual experiences represent genuine transcendence. Someone having a powerful visionary experience might be accessing genuine, subtle-level awareness, or they might be regressing to pre-personal, magic mythic consciousness and inflating it with spiritual significance. Distinguishing these required the kind of structural clarity that Wilber felt his developmental framework provided, but Jung's archetypal approach did not. Yet there was something Jung understood that Wilber's more rational and systematic approach sometimes seemed to miss. Jung recognized that the unconscious has its own language, fundamentally imagistic and symbolic rather than conceptual. Dreams do not present propositions to be analyzed. They present images to be experienced and held in consciousness until their meaning gradually reveals itself. Active imagination is not about understanding a symbol's meaning, but about entering into relationship with the autonomous figure that appears. This required a kind of receptivity and patience, a willingness to not know, that was different from the clarity and structure of Wilber's stage models. Jung also understood something about the necessary role of the shadow and the darkness in psychological and spiritual development. His concept of the shadow included not only personal repressions, but also collective evils, the capacity for destructive and cruel behavior that exists in every human psyche. Confronting the shadow was, for Jung, an essential part of individuation, and it was often the most difficult and painful work. It meant recognizing one's own capacity for hatred, greed, cruelty, and dishonesty. It meant accepting that the psyche contains not only noble archetypes like the hero and the wise old man, but also the trickster, the predator, the destroyer. Jung insisted that psychological wholeness required integrating the shadow rather than transcending it or leaving it behind. The person who claims to have transcended their darker impulses has likely only repressed them more deeply. True spiritual development does not mean becoming all light and goodness. It means becoming whole, which includes conscious relationship with one's darkness. Jung's late work on the answer to Job explored this theme theologically, arguing that the divine itself must be understood as containing both good and evil, both creation and destruction, if it is to be truly whole and complete. Wilber's developmental model, with its emphasis on transcending and including lower levels on the path to higher ones, sometimes seemed to Jung's followers to imply that the darker, more primitive aspects of the psyche could be left behind or sublimated. Wilber would argue this is a misreading. Each level must be integrated, not bypassed, and shadow work remains necessary at every stage. But the emphasis on ascent and evolution, on reaching toward ever higher levels, could create a subtle devaluation of the lower, the dark, the regressive. Jung's more circular and paradoxical approach, his insistence that the way up is also the way down, that light and dark must be held in tension rather than resolved hierarchically, spoke to a different kind of wisdom. Consider how each man would approach a specific experience. A vivid dream of a divine child appearing in a garden, radiating light, while in the corners of the garden shadowy figures lurk. Jung would honor this dream as a manifestation of the self-archetype, the divine child representing new psychological birth and potential. He would ask the dreamer to stay with the image, to paint it or sculpt it, to allow it to work on their consciousness. He would note the presence of the shadow figures asking what aspect of the personality they might represent, what has been excluded from consciousness. He would see the whole dream as compensatory, bringing into consciousness what the ego needs for greater wholeness. The interpretation would be patient, circular, allowing the image to reveal its meaning gradually through continued contemplation and through how it connects to other dreams and to the dreamer's life situation. Wilber would likely approach the same dream differently. He would want to understand what level of consciousness the dream reflects. Is the divine child a genuine, subtle level vision, or is it a regression to mythic, magical thinking? The shadow figures might represent not yet integrated aspects of earlier developmental stages that need to be worked through, or they might represent genuine, subtle level energies that appear dark only from the perspective of rational consciousness. The dream might be an invitation to deepen one's meditation practice and stabilize subtle level awareness. Or it might be compensation for spiritual bypassing, a reminder to do more shadow work before reaching for higher states. The interpretation would seek to place the dream within the larger map of development, understanding where the dreamer is in their journey and what this experience suggests about their next step. Both approaches have validity, and they are not necessarily contradictory, but they reflect different sensibilities, different ways of being with psychological experience. Jung's approach is more receptive, more willing to dwell in uncertainty, more focused on the unique symbolic language of the individual psyche. Wilber's is more directive, more confident in its diagnostic understanding, more focused on the universal patterns of development. To live in Jung's world is to be constantly in dialogue with mysterious depths that can never be fully understood. To live in Wilber's world is to be on a journey with a comprehensible map, climbing toward peaks that are distant but visible. Let these two sensibilities coexist in your awareness as you drift closer to sleep. Feel how each offers something essential. Jung whispers, "Slow down, listen, honor what arises from the depths. Trust the psyche's own wisdom." Wilber calls, "Look up, see the heights that await. Develop systematically toward ever greater consciousness." Both voices speak truth. Both invite transformation. The question of the collective dimension of consciousness reveals another crucial area of convergence and divergence between Jung and Wilber. For Jung, the collective unconscious was perhaps his most revolutionary concept. Against the prevailing view that the unconscious consisted only of personal, repressed material, Jung argued that beneath the personal unconscious lay a deeper stratum shared by all humanity, containing the archetypes and the great myths that structure human experience across cultures and epochs. Jung came to this concept through multiple paths. Clinically, he noticed that his patients' dreams and fantasies often contained symbols and motifs they could not have learned images from ancient mythology, alchemical symbolism, or religious traditions they knew nothing about. This suggested that these images were not learned, but inherited, part of the psyche's innate structure. Historically, he found striking parallels between symbols across cultures: the world tree, the divine marriage, the night sea journey, the dragon battle, suggesting universal patterns underlying diverse cultural expressions. And personally, his own visions during his confrontation with the unconscious presented him with figures and symbols that seemed to come from some timeless source. The collective unconscious, as Jung conceived it, was not simply a repository of cultural memories or shared human experiences. It was something more ontologically fundamental, a stratum of the psyche structured by archetypes that had evolved over millions of years of human and pre-human existence. These archetypes were, in some sense, the psychological equivalents of biological instincts, innate predispositions to respond to certain situations in certain ways. Just as a bird has an instinct to build a particular kind of nest without being taught, humans have an archetypal predisposition to experience mother in certain ways, to imagine divine figures, to go through processes of death and rebirth. This collective dimension meant that individual psychology was always embedded in something larger. A person's dreams were not merely personal, but connected them to the entire human story, to the myths and rituals through which humans have always sought meaning. A midlife crisis was not just an individual problem, but a manifestation of universal archetypal patterns of transformation. Psychological healing required not just resolving personal conflicts, but finding one's place in the larger mythic and archetypal story, recognizing oneself as participating in patterns that are eternally recurring. Jung's vision of the collective unconscious had profound implications for culture and history. He argued that cultures, like individuals, have a psyche, with conscious values and ideals and a shadow containing what the culture represses. The Nazis, in Jung's analysis, represented an eruption of archetypal forces that had been repressed in the German psyche. The ancient gods of blood and soil, the Wotan archetype of frenzy and destruction. When collective shadows are not acknowledged and integrated, they erupt in devastating ways. Jung saw the 20th century's catastrophic wars and genocides as manifestations of unconscious archetypal energies overwhelming rational consciousness. This gave Jung's psychology a tragic and urgent dimension. The task of individuation was not merely personal but had collective significance. By becoming conscious of the archetypal forces operating in their own psyches, individuals could avoid being unconsciously possessed by these forces. And if enough individuals achieved this consciousness, perhaps collective catastrophes could be prevented or at least mitigated. Jung's later writings often took on a prophetic tone, warning of the dangers of unconscious mass movements and calling for greater psychological consciousness as a necessity for human survival. Wilber both drew on and critiqued Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. He agreed that there are patterns that transcend individual experience and that these need to be accounted for in any comprehensive psychology. But he argued that Jung's formulation was too vague and too static. The collective unconscious seemed to exist outside of time, a timeless realm of eternal archetypes unchanged by history. This ignored the evolutionary dimension of consciousness. Humans today have psychological capacities and structures that earlier humans did not have. Consciousness has evolved, become more complex, developed new levels of organization. Wilber reinterpreted the collective dimension in terms of what he called the deep structures of consciousness at each level of development. These deep structures are universal patterns that all humans at a given stage share, shaped by evolution. But they are not timeless and unchanging. As consciousness evolves, new deep structures emerge. Early humanity, operating at archaic and magic levels of consciousness, had certain patterns of perception and meaning-making. Modern humans at rational levels have different structures, and humans developing into postmodern and integral and transpersonal levels are building yet new structures. What Jung called archetypes, Wilber suggested, were not eternal forms in some Platonic realm, but were the deep structures of consciousness at particular levels, especially the subtle level, where symbolic, visionary, and mythic awareness predominates. The hero archetype, for example, might be the deep structure of the self-sense at a particular stage of development, the pattern by which consciousness at that level organizes its experience of growth and challenge. But this archetype is not eternally the same. It manifests differently in different cultural contexts and at different overall levels of development. An ancient Greek hero, a medieval Christian saint, and a modern superhero are all expressions of hero energy, but they reflect very different worldviews and developmental levels. This reinterpretation allowed Wilber to honor Jung's insights while placing them in an evolutionary context. Yes, there are collective patterns. Yes, individuals connect to something larger than personal experience. But this larger context is not static and eternal. It is evolving. And the patterns that seem timeless and universal may actually be stage-specific, characteristic of particular levels of consciousness rather than fundamental to consciousness as such. Wilber also questioned whether the collective unconscious was truly unconscious in the way Jung described. If archetypes are the deep structures of consciousness, then they are not hidden in some inaccessible depth, but are actually the structures through which experience is organized. What we are unconscious of is not the archetypes themselves, but the fact that we are using them, much as we are usually unconscious of the grammatical structures through which we speak. Development brings not so much the archetypes from unconscious to conscious, but rather transcends one set of deep structures and moves to the next, gaining the ability to reflect on and objectify the structures that previously organized experience transparently. Furthermore, Wilber distinguished between the collective unconscious and what he called the transpersonal or spiritual dimensions of consciousness. Jung sometimes seemed to conflate the two, treating spiritual experiences as manifestations of archetypes from the collective unconscious. But Wilber argued that genuine spiritual realization is not about accessing some deep unconscious realm, but about developing to higher levels of consciousness that are actually beyond the personal rather than beneath it. The transpersonal is not the collective unconscious made conscious. It is the realization of consciousness itself as it exists beyond individual and collective forms. This distinction becomes important in understanding mystical experience. For Jung, a mystical vision of divine light or union with the cosmos would be understood as an encounter with the self-archetype, a manifestation of the psyche's inherent wholeness taking a particular symbolic form. The experience is psychologically real and transformative, but it is a psychological event happening within the psyche. Wilber would agree that the experience is real and transformative, but he would emphasize that at the highest transpersonal levels, it is not merely a psychological event, but a genuine realization of consciousness, recognizing its own nature, which transcends the psyche as usually conceived. The divine light is not just a symbol or archetype, but the actual nature of awareness itself when experienced at the subtle level. Union with the cosmos is not just a feeling, but a direct recognition of the non-dual nature of consciousness and reality. This difference reflects a fundamental disagreement about the scope of psychology. For Jung, psychology ultimately encompassed everything human, including religious and spiritual experience, because everything human involves the psyche. To say that a spiritual experience is psychological is not to reduce it or explain it away. It is simply to acknowledge that it happens in and through the psyche. Psychology, in this sense, is the queen of the sciences, the discipline that addresses meaning and experience in their fullness. For Wilber, psychology is important, but not all-encompassing. It addresses certain levels and dimensions of consciousness, but not all of them. At the highest transpersonal levels, Experience transcends what can be called psychological in the usual sense. It becomes ontological and metaphysical. At the non-dual level, consciousness realizes it is not separate from reality, not a subject observing objects, but the unified field in which both subject and object arise. This is not a psychological insight in the same way that understanding a personal complex is psychological. It is a direct realization of what consciousness essentially is, which includes but transcends individual psychology. These theoretical differences about the collective dimensions of consciousness reflect different ways of understanding human unity and diversity. For Jung, what humans share most fundamentally is the collective unconscious, the archetypal structures that make us all human despite cultural and individual differences. Cultural diversity reflects different ways of expressing and elaborating these universal patterns. The myths and religions of the world are different languages speaking the same eternal truths, different cultural clothing for the same archetypal realities. This gave Jung's psychology a universalizing tendency, finding parallels and equivalences across traditions, seeking the common archetypal core. For Wilber, what humans share is a common path of development through increasingly complex and adequate stages of consciousness, but they are at different places along this path. Cultural diversity reflects not just different expressions of the same deep patterns, but genuinely different levels of cognitive, moral, and spiritual development. A tribal society operating at a magic mythic level and a modern society operating at a rational pluralistic level are not just expressing the same archetypes differently. They are at different evolutionary stages. This allowed Wilber to make judgments about development that Jung would have been more reluctant to make. Some cultural forms are more evolved, more adequate, more capable of addressing complexity than others. This does not mean some people are better than others, but it does mean that development is directional and that later stages transcend and include earlier ones. This developmental approach has been controversial, with critics arguing that it reflects a Western bias and a kind of spiritual elitism, ranking cultures and people hierarchically. Wilber has responded to these critiques extensively, arguing that recognizing developmental levels is not the same as devaluing people at earlier stages, any more than recognizing that adults have cognitive capacities children do not yet have means devaluing children. And he points out that in his integral model, level is only one dimension. People can be highly developed in some lines and less developed in others. A brilliant scientist might be at a very high cognitive level, but a low interpersonal or spiritual level. An indigenous shaman might operate from a magic mythic worldview, but have extraordinary development in certain spiritual capacities. Still, the tension remains. Jung's more circular and paradoxical approach, his willingness to honor the wisdom in supposedly primitive forms, his sense that modern rational consciousness has lost something that earlier forms possessed. These reflect a humility and receptivity that can feel absent in Wilber's confident mapping of developmental hierarchies. Jung knew he did not have all the answers, and that the unconscious could always surprise him with something genuinely new. Wilber's integral theory, for all its comprehensiveness, can seem closed, as if the basic map is complete and only details remain to be filled in. Yet Wilber would respond that humility does not require refusing to discriminate between more and less adequate levels of development. To say that rationality is more adequate than magical thinking is not arrogance, but recognition of the actual evolutionary achievement rationality represents. And genuine humility requires acknowledging that current levels of development are not the end, that there are always higher possibilities, that one's own understanding is partial and limited by one's current level of development. Wilber has often spoken about how his own understanding has evolved through stages, how he had to revise his theories multiple times as he saw more clearly the patterns he was trying to articulate. The question of individuation versus transcendence brings these tensions into sharp focus. For Jung, individuation was the supreme goal of psychological development. To become an individual, whole and complete, integrating conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, personal and collective, was the meaning of human life, especially in its second half. The individuated person has achieved a kind of wholeness symbolized by the mandala, the circle with a center, the squared circle, the union of opposites. They have related to the self archetype and allowed it to reorganize the personality around this deeper center rather than around the ego's limited concerns. But individuation, as Jung conceived it, is never complete. It is a process, not a final state. One circumambulates the self, returning again and again to central mysteries from ever-deepening angles. There is no transcending the human condition, no final escape from the tensions and paradoxes of existence. The goal is not to become a god or to merge with the absolute, but to become fully oneself, with all the limitations and particularity that entails. There is something profoundly incarnational about Jung's vision, a sense that consciousness needs to be grounded in the body, in matter, in the earth, rather than fleeing into pure spirit. Jung's work on alchemy reflected this understanding. He saw alchemy not as primitive chemistry, but as a symbolic language for psychological and spiritual transformation, the process by which base matter is gradually refined into gold, by which the multiplicity of the personality is slowly cooked down to an essential unity. But the gold, at the end of the alchemical process, is not pure transcendence. It is the philosopher's stone, matter transformed, but still matter, spirit, embodied. The goal is the coniunctio, the sacred marriage, the union of opposites that produces not separation, but integration, not escape, but wholeness. Wilber's vision of the highest human potential was different. Yes, individuation in Jung's sense is important, but it is a mid-level achievement, what Wilber would call the centaur level, where mind and body, persona and shadow begin to be integrated. But this is not the end point. Beyond the integrated personal self lie the transpersonal stages where the separate self-sense begins to dissolve and consciousness recognizes its true nature. At the subtle level, one realizes awareness as divine light, luminous and blissful, pervaded by love and insight. At the causal level, one rests as pure emptiness, the unborn witness prior to all form and experience. At the non-dual level, even the witnessing subject dissolves, and consciousness recognizes itself as the totality, not separate from anything, the seamless whole in which everything arises and returns. These higher stages, for Wilber, represent the genuinely transpersonal, beyond the personal self that Jung's individuation brings to wholeness. And they are the real goal of human development, the cutting edge of evolution. To stop at individuation is to stop halfway, to achieve personal integration but not cosmic realization. This does not mean transcending the personal in the sense of abandoning it or devaluing it. The transpersonal transcends and includes the personal. One does not lose one's individuality at non-dual realization. One recognizes that individuality as a perfect expression of the whole, not separate from it. But there is a quality of ascent in Wilber's vision, a reaching beyond the human towards something more that differs from Jung's insistence on remaining grounded in the earthly and human. For Jung, the danger was always inflation, the ego identifying with archetypal powers and losing its human perspective. He was suspicious of claims to have transcended the ego or realized enlightenment, seeing in them often a subtle form of ego inflation masquerading as spiritual attainment. The true task was not to transcend the ego, but to relativize it, to recognize it as one part of a larger psyche, necessary and valuable, but not the center. The self was paradoxically both more than the ego and its foundation, both the goal and the origin, but relating to the self meant remaining human, not becoming divine. Wilber would see this as Jung's brilliance and his limitation. Jung was right to warn against inflation and pseudo-spirituality. The ego, attempting to claim non-dual realization without having gone through all the developmental stages, is indeed inflation. But genuine non-dual realization, stabilized through years of practice and maturity across all developmental lines, is not ego inflation but ego transcendence. It is the recognition that what you thought was your separate self was always already one with the infinite, that awareness itself is not bound by individual identity. The practical implications of these different visions are significant. For someone working with Jungian analysis, the focus is on dreams, active imagination, understanding one's psychological types, recognizing archetypal patterns in relationships and life crises, integrating the shadow, dialoguing with inner figures, honoring symbols that carry numinous power. The work is largely imagistic and symbolic, focused on allowing unconscious contents to emerge and be related to consciously. Progress is measured not by achievement of specific states or stages, but by the depth and richness of one's relationship with the unconscious, by the gradual transformation of symptoms into symbols, by the increasing ability to hold paradox and tension without collapsing into one-sided positions. For someone working with integral approaches informed by Wilber, the focus is on understanding one's current developmental level, identifying areas where development is needed, engaging practices specific to the next level of growth, and cultivating state experiences that provide glimpses of higher stages. This might include developmental assessments, meditation practices carefully chosen for one's level, shadow work when needed, expanding perspectives through exposure to more complex worldviews, and integration work to ensure that development is balanced across multiple lines. Progress is measured by actual shifts in how one perceives and makes meaning, by the increased complexity and adequacy of one's worldview, by the stabilization of state experiences into trait consciousness. Both approaches can facilitate profound transformation, but they feel different in practice. Jungian work has a quality of mysterious depth, of never quite knowing where the process is leading, of being in conversation with something that exceeds comprehension. Wilber's integral practice has a quality of clear directionality, of knowing the territory one is moving through, of having confidence in the path even when the journey is difficult. One is an exploration of the depths, the other a climb to the heights. One emphasizes receptivity and allowing, the other discipline and development. One trusts the psyche's wisdom, the other trusts the map of consciousness that has been painstakingly constructed. These different emphases reflect Jung's and Wilber's personal temperaments and life experiences. Jung was an introvert who trusted his inner experience profoundly, who had learned through his confrontation with the unconscious that the psyche contains an intelligence beyond the ego's understanding. His natural inclination was to attend inward, to listen, to wait for images and insights to emerge. He was also a man who had experienced devastating psychotic-like states and found his way through them by engaging the contents rather than trying to eliminate them. This gave him enormous respect for the unconscious and enormous skepticism toward any ego-based claims to mastery or transcendence. Wilber was a brilliant abstract thinker who could see patterns across vast bodies of knowledge and synthesize them into comprehensive frameworks. His natural gift was for creating order and structure, for seeing how different elements fit into larger wholes. He was also influenced by intensive meditation practice in traditions that emphasize the highest attainments of consciousness, that provide detailed maps of contemplative stages, and that promise genuine liberation through sustained practice. This gave him confidence that consciousness can be systematically developed and that clear understanding of the territory is both possible and valuable. Their dialogue, imagined across the decades that separate them, might sound like this. Jung cautions Wilber that his maps, for all their brilliance, risk reducing the mystery of the psyche to an intellectual system, that the living reality of archetypal experience cannot be fully captured by developmental stages, that the wisdom of the unconscious often contradicts rational understanding, that the goal is not to transcend the human but to become fully human. Wilber responds that Jung's refusal to clearly distinguish levels and stages leaves people confused about what is progression and what is regression, that not all archetypal experiences are equally valuable or healthy, that honoring mystery does not mean refusing discernment, that the human has further to evolve, and that this evolution requires more than circular integration of opposites. Jung says, "The psyche has a wisdom beyond our understanding. Trust it, listen to it, allow transformation to happen according to its own logic." Wilber says, "Consciousness develops according to discoverable patterns. Understand them, work with them consciously, and you can facilitate genuine growth." Jung says, "Go deep into your own particularity, your own symbols, your own unique path toward wholeness." Wilber says, "Recognize the universal patterns at work in your experience and understand where you are in the common journey of consciousness evolution." Jung says, "The self is the goal, the center that holds all opposites in creative tension." Wilber says, "The self is not the goal, but a way station. Beyond it lie the pure witness, and beyond that the non-dual realization where self and other are recognized as one." Can you feel how each position carries truth? How each reveals something essential that the other risks missing? In the stillness of this moment, as the world grows quiet and sleep approaches, let both visions exist side by side in your awareness. Let Jung's depth and Wilber's height be held together without forcing them to resolve into a single view. There is a teaching here about how we hold different perspectives, different truths that seem to contradict each other. Jung's psychology and Wilber's integral theory represent genuinely different ways of understanding consciousness, not easily reconciled. But perhaps they do not need to be reconciled into a single system. Perhaps the conversation between them, the creative tension of their different emphases, is more valuable than any synthesis that would smooth over their real differences. This is, in fact, something that both men understood in their own ways. Jung's entire psychology is built on the productive tension of opposites, the recognition that truth often lies in paradox rather than in resolving to one side. He distrusted final answers and systematic completeness, preferring to circle around mysteries that remain mysterious. Wilber, despite his love of comprehensive frameworks, has consistently emphasized that his integral model is just a map, not the territory, and that it must be held lightly and revised as understanding grows. Both men, each in his own way, recognize that ultimate truth exceeds any framework we construct. So perhaps the deepest wisdom emerging from their dialogue is not about which vision is correct, but about how we can hold multiple perspectives, honor different truths, and remain open to dimensions of reality that exceed our current understanding. This is, after all, what both Jung's individuation and Wilber's integral consciousness ultimately point toward: a more expansive, inclusive, flexible way of being that can embrace complexity without collapsing into confusion, that can honor structure without becoming rigid, that can trust depths without drowning in them, that can reach toward heights without losing ground. As we move into the final movement of this extended meditation on Jung and Wilber, let us dwell in the implications of their dialogue for how we understand consciousness, transformation, and the meaning of human existence. Let us reflect on what their combined insights reveal, what questions they illuminate, what possibilities they open. Both Jung and Wilber understood that human consciousness is not a simple thing, not reducible to neural processes or behavioral patterns, not fully captured by rational analysis. Both insisted that consciousness has dimensions that our ordinary waking awareness does not access, depths and heights that require special approaches to encounter and understand. Both believed that most humans live at a fraction of their potential, identified with a small part of themselves, while vast territories of consciousness remain unexplored. And both dedicated their lives to mapping these territories and helping others access them. This shared conviction that consciousness can be transformed, expanded, and deepened puts both men in the tradition of what might be called the perennial philosophy, the recognition found in mystical and contemplative traditions across cultures that reality is not what it appears to be, that consciousness can awaken to levels of being and knowing that radically exceed ordinary experience. Whether we call this individuation or non-dual realization, whether we speak of archetypes or stages of consciousness, the underlying intuition is the same. We are not who we think we are, and becoming who we truly are requires a profound transformation of consciousness. Yet the maps they provide of this transformation differ significantly, and these differences matter. If Jung is right that the psyche has its own wisdom and that transformation happens through dialogue with autonomous unconscious contents following their own logic, then the appropriate stance is one of receptivity, patience, and trust. We must learn to listen to dreams, honor symbols, allow time for meanings to emerge gradually, and resist the ego's desire to control or direct the process. Psychological growth is not something we do, but something that happens to us when we create the conditions for it, when we attend to what arises from the depths with respect and curiosity. If Wilber is right that consciousness develops through discoverable stages following universal patterns, then the appropriate stance is more active and intentional. We must understand where we are in the developmental sequence, what practices will facilitate growth to the next level, where our shadows and fixations are blocking development, and how to cultivate state experiences that preview higher stages. Transformation requires not just waiting for the unconscious to deliver insights, but actively engaging in practices known to produce specific kinds of growth meditation, to develop witnessing capacity, perspective-taking exercises to expand cognition, shadow work to integrate disowned parts, studies of more complex systems to build conceptual capacity. Which approach is more effective likely depends on the person, the situation, and what is being addressed. Some people and some issues respond better to Jung's receptive, depth-oriented approach. Others benefit more from Wilber's active, development-oriented approach, and most comprehensive transformation probably requires both the receptive opening to unconscious depths and the active development of new capacities and perspectives. This suggests that rather than choosing between Jung and Wilber, the wisdom lies in understanding what each approach offers and when each is most appropriate. When someone is caught in repetitive patterns that seem to have unconscious roots, when dreams and synchronicities are pregnant with meaning, when archetypal forces seem to be constellating in one's life, Jung's approach provides invaluable guidance. When someone is stuck at a particular level of development, when their meaning-making capacity is inadequate to the complexity they face, when they need to cultivate higher states of consciousness, Wilber's framework offers crucial direction. Moreover, the two approaches can be integrated, each correcting potential limitations of the other. Jung's depth work can be enriched by Wilber's developmental clarity, helping to distinguish when unconscious contents represent regression to pre-personal states versus genuine access to transpersonal realms. Active imagination with archetypal figures can be understood as engaging the deep structures of particular levels of consciousness, and the evolution of these figures over time in analysis might reflect actual developmental movement through stages. Wilber's integral practice can be enriched by Jung's attention to the unique symbolic language of the individual psyche. Rather than assuming everyone at a particular stage will have similar experiences, we can recognize that universal deep structures manifest through highly individual surface structures shaped by personal history, culture, and the particular archetypal patterns activated in one's life. Meditation practice can be enhanced by Jungian attention to what the unconscious is trying to communicate through resistance, distraction, or unusual experiences that arise on the cushion. This integration is not just theoretical, but has practical implications for how we approach our own psychological and spiritual development. It suggests a path that honors both depth and height, both the unique particularity of individual experience and the universal patterns of consciousness evolution. Such a path would include practices like meditation and contemplation to develop higher states and stages, shadow work to integrate disowned aspects, dream work and active imagination to dialogue with the unconscious, study to expand conceptual frameworks, and most importantly, a fundamental attitude of humble openness to dimensions of consciousness that exceed current understanding. But beyond the practical implications for individual development, the dialogue between Jung and Wilber illuminates fundamental questions about the nature of reality and consciousness itself. Is consciousness something that has evolved and is still evolving toward ever higher forms? Or is it something fundamentally complete and whole that individual consciousnesses gradually realize through removing obscurations and integrating what has been split off? Is the direction of growth primarily forward and upward, or is it more circular, a return to wholeness that was always already present but obscured? Wilber would answer that evolution is real, that consciousness genuinely develops new capacities that did not exist before, and that this process is directional and potentially unlimited. The universe is becoming more conscious, more complex, more integrated, and human consciousness is the leading edge of this cosmic process. We are literally the universe becoming aware of itself, and as we develop to higher levels, we participate in evolution's ongoing creation of new possibilities. In this view, the highest forms of consciousness accessible to contemporary contemplatives may not be the final word. New levels may emerge in the future, capacities and modes of awareness we cannot currently imagine. Evolution continues. Jung would answer that consciousness does not evolve in this linear way, but rather deepens, becomes more conscious of what was always already there in the unconscious depths. The archetypes and the self have always existed. They do not evolve, but simply manifest in different forms at different times. Individual consciousness does develop, moving from unconscious participation with the collective toward greater differentiation, and then toward conscious reunion with the depths. But this is more like a spiral returning to its source, with greater awareness than like a ladder climbing to unprecedented heights. The goal is not to become something we have never been, but to realize and integrate what we have always been but did not recognize. This difference reflects two great metaphors for spiritual development found across wisdom traditions. One metaphor is the mountain climb. Spiritual development is ascent from the valley of ignorance to the peak of enlightenment, a progressive journey upward through stages of increasing altitude and expanding view. The other metaphor is the return home. Spiritual development is remembering what we have forgotten, removing veils that obscure our true nature, realizing what was always already the case, but was not recognized. Wilber emphasizes the mountain climb, Jung the return home. Both metaphors capture something true. We do develop genuinely new capacities. A person who has stabilized non-dual awareness has something they did not have before the long years of practice that got them there. But we also discover that what is realized was in some sense always present. The Buddha nature or the self or the witness consciousness was not created by practice but only recognized. This paradox, that genuine development leads to the realization of what was always already the case, is one that both Jung and Wilber encountered, though they emphasized different aspects of it. Perhaps we can say that consciousness evolves in its forms and capacities, while its deepest nature remains unchanged. The structures through which awareness operates become more complex and adequate through development, but awareness itself, the pure fact of consciousness, does not change. The ocean's surface ripples and waves in ever more intricate patterns, but the water itself is always the same. Wilber maps the evolution of the wave's patterns. Jung dives beneath the surface to the unchanging depths. Both are describing the same ocean. This reconciling perspective suggests that the apparent contradiction between depth and height, between circular return and linear ascent, may be resolved at a higher level of understanding. What if consciousness simultaneously descends into depths and ascends to heights, with both movements ultimately reaching the same realization from different directions? Jung's path of descending into the unconscious to encounter the self, and Wilber's path of ascending through stages to realize the non-dual might be two sides of a single transformative journey, two aspects of a larger pattern that includes both movements. In mystical literature, we find this paradox repeatedly. The way up is the way down. The highest is the deepest. Transcendence and immanence ultimately unite. The Christian mystic Meister Eckhart spoke of God's ground and the soul's ground as one ground. The Hindu Upanishads declared that Atman and Brahman, the innermost self and the ultimate reality, are identical. The Buddhist concept of emptiness, sunyata, is simultaneously the deepest truth about phenomena and the highest realization. These teachings suggest that the depth Jung explored and the height Wilber mapped might meet at a point that is both the deepest depth and the highest height, the center that is everywhere and the circumference that contains everything. If this is so, then the practical question is not whether to go deep or go high, but how to honor both movements in one's practice and development. This might mean alternating between periods of Jungian depth work, attending to dreams and engaging the unconscious, and periods of intensive meditation practice aimed at stabilizing higher states. It might mean simultaneously working on integrating shadow material and cultivating witnessing awareness. It might mean understanding one's developmental level while remaining open to unconscious contents that exceed any developmental map. It might mean trusting both the structure of the path and the wisdom of what emerges spontaneously from the depths. Such an approach would be genuinely integral, in Wilber's sense, while remaining true to Jung's insistence on the autonomous reality and wisdom of the psyche. It would see the person not as a project to be optimally developed according to a predetermined sequence, but as a mystery, gradually revealing itself through both the unfolding of developmental potentials and the emergence of unique archetypal patterns. It would honor both the universal structures that all humans share and the radically individual symbolic language through which each person's psyche speaks. This balanced approach also addresses a limitation that each system has when taken alone. Pure Jungianism, without developmental understanding, can become lost in an endless exploration of symbolic meanings without clear direction or progress, can mistake regression for depth, can rationalize any psychological content as potentially meaningful archetypal material. Pure Wilberian developmentalism, without attention to the unique symbolic languages of the individual psyche, can become overly schematic and intellectualized, can mistake conceptual understanding for lived realization, can suppress or dismiss psychological contents that do not fit the developmental map. Together, Jung and Wilber offer complementary correctives. Jung reminds Wilber that the psyche is not just a system to be understood, but a living reality to be encountered, that symbols and images carry meanings that exceed conceptual frameworks, that development must remain grounded in the actual movements of the individual soul. Wilber reminds Jung that not all depths are equally deep, that discrimination and structure are necessary to avoid confusion, that consciousness genuinely evolves, and we can facilitate this evolution through clear understanding and appropriate practices. Their dialogue also illuminates the relationship between psychology and spirituality, a relationship both complex and contested in modern Western culture. Jung attempted to create a psychology that honored spiritual experience without making metaphysical claims about ultimate reality. His approach allowed people to take their inner experience seriously, as psychologically real and meaningful, without requiring traditional religious belief. This was liberating for many who could no longer accept religious doctrines but still sense something numinous and transcendent in existence. But Jung's approach also raised difficult questions. If we speak only of psychological reality, are we not reducing spiritual experience to something subjective and internal? Is the God image in the psyche really all we can speak of? Or does our experience of the sacred point towards something objectively real beyond the psyche? Jung studied agnosticism on these metaphysical questions, satisfied neither believers who felt he was reducing religion to psychology, nor secular critics who felt he was smuggling spiritual claims under the guise of psychological language. Wilber attempted to address this confusion by clearly distinguishing between levels of reality and corresponding epistemologies. Physical reality is real and can be studied through empirical science. Mental reality, the realm of meaning, interpretation, and intersubjective understanding, is real and can be studied through hermeneutic and phenomenological methods. Spiritual reality, the domain of contemplative experience and mystical realization, is real and can be studied through introspective and meditative methods. Each level has its own ontology and epistemology, and confusion arises when we apply methods appropriate to one level to another level. In this framework, Jung's psychological language is appropriate for describing the structures and dynamics of the psyche at various levels, but it is not adequate for describing the highest transpersonal realizations, which are not merely psychological but ontological. When a person has non-dual realization, they are not just having a psychological experience of unity. They are directly recognizing the non-dual nature of consciousness and reality. This is not reducible to psychology any more than mathematics is reducible to the psychology of mathematicians. This clarification is valuable, but it also risks creating a new dualism between psychological and spiritual, between the psyche and ultimate consciousness. Jung's refusal to make this separation, his insistence on speaking only of psychological experience while leaving metaphysical questions open, preserved a kind of unity that Wilber's more differentiated framework risks losing. There is something important in Jung's hesitation to claim more than he could know through direct experience, his humility before ultimate questions, his recognition that the moment we make definite metaphysical claims, we are moving beyond what experience itself warrants. Perhaps the deepest teaching emerging from their dialogue is precisely this: the need to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to honor both structure and mystery, both clarity and uncertainty, both the knowable and the unknowable. Both Jung and Wilber, despite their differences, were pointing toward dimensions of consciousness that exceed ordinary awareness. Both insisted that transformation is possible, that we do not have to remain confined to our current limitations. And both recognized that this transformation is not easy or automatic, but requires dedication, courage, and sustained effort. What they offer, ultimately, are two different kinds of maps for the journey of consciousness. Jung's map is like an old nautical chart, beautiful and evocative, showing coastlines and depths, marked with warnings about dangerous passages and notes about wonders encountered, but deliberately leaving much of the territory unmarked, unknown, open to exploration. Wilber's map is like a modern topographic map, precisely measured and scaled, with contour lines showing exact elevations, routes clearly marked, coordinates given, the entire territory systematically surveyed and charted. Both maps are useful for different purposes. Jung's map invites exploration, honors mystery, reminds us that the territory is alive and cannot be fully captured on paper. Wilber's map provides orientation, shows the lay of the land, helps us understand where we are and how to get where we want to go. A wise traveler might consult both maps, using each for what it does best, while remembering that even the most complete maps are not the territory itself. The territory itself, consciousness in its full depth and height, the psyche in its mysterious wholeness, the self-awakening to its true nature remains always more than any description can capture. Jung knew this and built it into his approach, preferring suggestive images and circular reasoning to systematic completeness. Wilber knows this too, despite his systematic thoroughness, and has always insisted that concepts and maps must finally be transcended in direct realization. So as this long meditation on their dialogue draws to a close, as your consciousness drifts towards sleep, let us honor what both men contributed to our understanding of consciousness and transformation. Let us appreciate Jung's profound respect for the unconscious, his willingness to take seriously the reality of symbols and images, his recognition that wholeness requires integrating rather than transcending our shadows and our depths. Let us appreciate Wilber's brilliant synthesis of knowledge from multiple domains, his articulation of developmental stages that help us understand where we are and where we can go, his systematic inclusion of insights from both science and spirituality. Let us recognize that we need both depth and height, both receptive exploration of what arises from within and active cultivation of higher capacities. Let us see that consciousness is simultaneously eternal and evolving, simultaneously simple presence and complex development, simultaneously already whole and progressively realizing that wholeness. And let us remember that both Jung and Wilber were, in the end, pointing beyond themselves, inviting us not to become Jungians or Wilberians, but to undertake our own journey into consciousness, to encounter the depths and scale the heights through our own lived experience. The maps they provided are gifts, tools for our use, but the journey itself is ours to make. In the space between waking and sleeping, where you now rest, you are consciousness itself, aware and present, participating in the mystery that Jung and Wilber each attempted to articulate. You contain depths that have never been fully explored, archetypal patterns waiting to be recognized, shadows seeking integration, potentials for development that exceed your current self-understanding. You are simultaneously the personal individual you know yourself to be and something much larger, a wave on the ocean of consciousness, a momentary expression of evolutionary becoming, a unique manifestation of the eternal self. The dialogue between Jung and Wilber continues in you as you navigate your own depths and heights, as you attend to both what arises from within and what beckons from beyond, as you become more fully yourself while recognizing your inseparability from the larger whole. Their conversation is not just historical or theoretical, but living and practical, an ongoing exploration of what consciousness is and what it can become. As sleep approaches, let all these ideas and images settle into the background, becoming part of the landscape of your dreaming mind. Let Jung and Wilber fade into the distance, their voices blending with all the other voices that have spoken about consciousness and transformation across human history. What remains is simply this: awareness, here and now, mysterious and self-evident, the ground of all experience and the goal of all seeking. Rest in that awareness. Let it hold you as you transition from waking consciousness into the altered state of sleep, from the thinking mind into the dreaming mind, from the individual sense of self into the ocean of consciousness from which all selves arise and to which all return. Tomorrow, when you wake, both Jung's depth and Wilber's height will be available to you, two perspectives you can draw on as you navigate your own journey. For now, simply rest. Let the great conversation between these two seekers of consciousness fade into silence. Let the mystery they both honored cradle you as you drift into sleep. The psyche knows its way. Consciousness evolves toward ever greater wholeness. And you, right now, in this moment between waking and dreaming, are the place where depth and height meet, where the eternal and the evolving embrace, where the mystery knows itself in yet another form. Sleep well, wanderer of consciousness. Dream deeply, and wake tomorrow to continue the journey that Jung and Wilber mapped, but that only you can walk, the journey into the fullness of what you are and what you might become. The story of their dialogue continues in you, in everyone who seeks to understand consciousness more deeply, to become more whole, to develop toward higher possibilities while honoring the depths from which we arise. It is a conversation without end, because consciousness itself is inexhaustible, always revealing new dimensions, always inviting further exploration and transformation. And so we close. This long contemplation where all journeys of consciousness ultimately lead to presence itself, to the simple fact of awareness, to the mystery that is never solved, but only lived more deeply. Jung and Wilber, for all their profound differences, both arrived at this recognition in their own ways. And it is here, in this simple presence, that their dialogue finally resolves not into a synthesis, but into silence, the silence from which all words arise and to which all return, the silence that is consciousness recognizing itself beyond all concepts, all maps, all theories and frameworks. Rest in that silence now. You have journeyed far tonight through psychological landscapes and spiritual territories, through the visions of two great explorers of consciousness. Let all of it settle and integrate as you sleep, becoming part of your own deepening understanding. The journey continues always. Consciousness never stops unfolding, revealing, becoming. But for now, in this moment, the journey pauses. You have reached a resting place. Dwell here. Be still. Let sleep come. And know that when you wake, the conversation between depth and height, between Jung and Wilber, between the eternal and the evolutionary, will continue, not as abstract theory, but as your own lived experience, your own exploration of what consciousness is and what it might become. Good night, seeker. May your dreams be deep and your awakening bright. May you integrate what you have learned tonight into your ongoing journey toward wholeness and transcendence, toward the realization of what you most truly are. The story ends here, but consciousness never ends. It simply continues, in you, as you, transforming moment by moment, depth by depth, height by height, forever unfolding toward possibilities we can barely imagine, but which call to us nonetheless, inviting us always forward and inward, upward and downward, into the great mystery that Jung and Wilber, each in his own way, dedicated their lives to exploring and sharing. Sleep now. The exploration continues tomorrow.